But what you'll notice is that there is no Northwest Airlines and there is no Continental Airlines.
Mhm.
So why do you think those kind of like major players made different decisions? Welcome to our interview. How are you feeling this morning?
Good, thanks. How are you?
I am fantastic. So we are going to do a case interview today. I want to give you a little bit of prep before we dive in, just a couple of things to be mindful of. So first of all, this is an interviewer-driven case, right? And so what that means is I might ask you, like, companies facing XYZ problem, what's your recommendation in terms of how to investigate? And you might say, I want to look at A, right? What I will do is say, that's a fine answer, right? If it is, ask you some follow-up questions. But then I'm going to ask you to do the next thing that I want us to look at, right? So I might say, yeah, A is a great idea, but I want to look at B. That does not mean that you are doing a bad job. What it means is that I have certain modules and questions that I need to get to make sure I am evaluating, a bunch of different categories of performance. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. Sounds great.
Cool. Any questions about the structure before we dive in?
No, I'm ready to go.
Awesome. This is going to be great. All right. Your client, Alaska Air Group, has recently finalized its acquisition of Hawaiian Holdings, bringing together the distinct brands of Alaska Airlines and Hawaiian Airlines. The merger opens up new opportunities across an expanded network, promising enhanced customer service and operational efficiency. The client wants to make sure it gets the most value out of the merger and has turned to our firm for support. How should Alaska Air Group proceed to maximize value in the post-merger landscape?
Great. Sounds like a super interesting case. We all love flying to Hawaii and to Alaska. So maybe out of this case, we'll get a free trip. A couple of questions for you before we dive into the framework. The first is just regarding the objective. So you mentioned that the case was focused on how to maximize the value. Is there any specific objective that they're hoping to maximize or any specific metric that they're going to be aiming for?
Sure. I mean, this is obviously a for-profit case. And so kind of the typical for-profit objectives, right? Would like to increase revenue, would like to find cost savings. So that means both like operational synergies, and anything else we can do, and would like to do that in a defensible way, right? Meaning longer term.
Perfect. Okay, makes sense. And can you clarify for me what the size of each firm is? So maybe in terms of, I don't know, the flights per day or the revenue that each firm sort of brings in, just to ground ourselves in like how big and whether there's a big size difference between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Alaska Airlines, as befitting its role as the purchaser, is certainly the larger of the two, operating about 1,200 flights a day, revenue of about $8.2 billion annual.
Yep.
Hawaiian, meanwhile, 300 flights, 2.8 billion in revenue.
Okay, sounds great. And then in terms of sort of the markets that each of them serve, so I'd imagine that Alaska Airlines focuses on Alaska and Hawaiian Airlines focuses on Hawaii.
Nailed.
But
You're clearly an airline expert.
they probably go into some other regions as well.
Sure.
Do they each serve their specific markets? Is there any overlap in between those markets? I think that'll just be helpful to know as we think about synergies.
Yep. So you can think about Alaska Airlines as basically a West US airlines, so including Alaska, but there are connections to other states and some international destinations in Canada, Mexico, and it serves Costa Rica. Hawaiian, kind of like a Pacific-based, right? So really focused on inner island flights within Hawaii and then direct flights from Hawaii to the US mainland. Also has some international routes, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and South Pacific. And there is some overlap in service, though not a ton, primarily between the routes between Hawaii and the US mainland, but otherwise like largely non-overlapping networks.
Got it. Okay, helpful. And then similarly, in terms of the markets, would love to hear a little bit about the customers served. So is there any specific information you have on customer segments that they each target? It sounds like since Hawaiian is focused on the Hawaii sort of inter-island, it might be like more so Hawaiian locals, but probably a lot of tourists as well. So just would love to hear a bit about that.
Yeah, tons of tourists on Hawaii. It's basically a flying daiquiri. Um, and So they are largely, certainly like very much focused on that leisure travel segment.
Mm.
Inter-island to your point, right? Like some of that is commuting, seeing relatives, that kind of stuff, a little less leisure for the locals. Um, Alaska, serves certainly like a good amount of leisure as well, but has a broader corporate base, given its presence on the West Coast and, between West Coast airports.
Perfect. Would you mind if I take a minute to think about how I would sort of structure and think about this case?
Rock and roll. Let's do it.
Perfect. So I'm just going to sort of turn this around for a second so that you can see the framework that I've come up with here. Move my face out of the way. So as we have discussed, the goal of this case is to think about how to maximize merger value. So that's sort of in this main bucket here. And then I've split it down into revenue growth and cost efficiencies, which I think are sort of the two main drivers that you can come back to in this case. So under revenue growth, there are two main pillars. There's market expansion, which I think could be like any new routes that neither of the airlines currently serve that they might be able to serve. We can think about partnerships. So maybe because of this enhanced, the size of the new company, there could be better partnerships. They could become part of one of the alliances. I think there's like Star Alliance, and I'm not exactly sure what they all are, but maybe they could think about a new partnership. And then there's also the ability to do some cargo revenue. So maybe with these new routes, or maybe with some of the routes that they currently do, they can expand to cargo revenue in addition to their passenger revenue. So that's something to explore. Then in terms of non-flight revenue, I think there's maybe an additional loyalty program that could be taken advantage of, bundled services. So actually bundling together, like whether it be flights and like hotel package or the car rental. I feel like you always see that when you book flights these days, and I have no idea about what the economics are on that, but they could look into that. And then the last one is maybe advertising revenue. So sort of taking advantage of advertising, like other services or things to do within the countries when they get there. You mentioned a lot of tourism, so that might be a good one. Then in terms of cost efficiencies, I think there's operational synergies, and that could be route optimization, for example, or fleet rationalization. So route optimization being like going from place to place, or maybe thinking of a hub and spoke model. And then fleet rationalization is saying like, what is the exact number of flights that we need, making sure that there's not too many, but also not too few, would probably be easier to do when you just have a bigger airline. And then the second one is the tech and staffing synergies. So from a tech stack perspective, like making sure that there aren't two booking systems that you're paying a fee on, and making sure that there aren't two like route. I'm sure they're like mapping the routes and mapping the occupancy. So any type of technology around that. And then similarly around staffing, like you only need one CFO probably. So you can think about how you can cut some headcount across the organization. How does that sound to you? Is that sort of along the lines of what you're thinking?
No, I mean, I think like great start makes a lot of sense. I think my kind of like my follow-up question would be if we added kind of like the dimension of time, right? Like limited resources, like where would you start, right? Do you start cost? Do you start revenue? Where specifically within that? Like how would you actually start?
Yeah, I would definitely start on the market expansion piece under revenue growth. So I always try and think about these things in terms of like growing the business rather than cutting, especially when it's like there's this new beginning and it's an exciting opportunity. I think like the opportunity to grow is endless and the opportunity to cut is obviously finite. So I like to think about sort of in the more positive light. And just from a market expansion perspective, I think there are so many potential opportunities there to expand routes, to think about a new model. And I think that's like a really exciting way for the company to first start.
Awesome. All right. So the next question we're going to tackle is one around branding.
Okay.
So Alaska is currently deliberating a significant branding decision post-merger. With the integration of Hawaiian Holdings, the company is torn between two strategic paths. Path one, rolling both airlines into a single unified brand to streamline operations, strengthen market identity, or path two, maintaining the distinct brands of Alaska and Hawaiian to preserve their unique market positions. How should our client make this decision?
Okay. So it sounds like the two decisions are either combine it into one or keep it as two separate brands.
That's right.
And Perfect. When I think about that, I want to think back to the framework that we had, where we're really thinking about like the whole case is surrounded around maximizing revenue and making the company more valuable. So when we look at that, let's look at it again from the revenue and the cost perspective. So as I had mentioned sort of 1 minute ago in terms of the costs, I think that although with one brand, there would probably be fewer physical and digital assets, it's probably a fairly limited amount of synergies that you could create. Like, as I mentioned, maybe you can get rid of one of the CFOs, maybe there are a couple like people who you can, but overall, you're not going to be able to get that many cost savings. I really see the biggest potential here on the revenue side. So that's where I'd sort of like to focus. And if we think about having one brand, I think some of the maybe positives towards revenue are greater customer loyalty, greater scale of the brand. So you could actually like have bigger brand reach geographically, and greater synergies in Hawaii and Alaska travel. So you can actually have, I mean, both of them are kind of in unique positions geographically to the US. So I think there are some interesting synergies you could create there. But when we look at two brands, I actually think that having like specific names to the locations, if you're in Hawaii and you're going from island to island, being able to go on like Hawaiian Airlines, it does sound pretty cool. And it's sort of like that brand reputation would carry a little bit more weight tied specifically to that region. And similarly, it sounds like they have kind of unique offerings and unique propositions to their customers. The inter-island travel within Hawaii, for example. So I think for me, the revenue of the two brands really outweighs the revenue for the one brand, and the cost is fairly negligible. In order to make like a full decision, what I would want to evaluate in terms of the next steps are trying to tie some financial metrics to each of these more qualitative pieces that I have here. And also just looking at if there are other airline mergers that we can look at as sort of comparables to see what they did and how it ended up turning out for them.
Great. I'd love to just kind of like explore that second part that you just mentioned there, which is other airline mergers,
Yeah.
right? So, the two that kind of spring to mind, like in my lifetime that were like major US mergers, right, is Delta buying Northwest Airlines, and United buying Continental,
Okay.
and somebody bought somebody else in American, but I forget what that was. But what you'll notice is that there is no Northwest Airlines and there is no Continental Airlines.
Mhm.
So why do you think those kind of like major players made different decisions?
Yeah, and I think that thank you for pointing those out. I actually was not aware of those two mergers. So I think looking into that and fully diagnosing and understanding would be a great next step. But just off a hunch and off sort of what I can imagine, I think it's probably because the locations of Hawaii and Alaska actually carry more like weight of the brand of those locations than
Yeah,
West does. I'm not even really sure what that, I'm not American, but I'm not even sure like exactly what the Northwest is, to be honest. Whereas everyone knows what Hawaii is and everyone wants to go there. So I think it's just a little bit more of like the brand of the actual place that they represent is more pronounced.
sure.
And so by the airline carrying that brand, they're sort of like taking on the positive effects that the brand of the place actually has in itself.
Got it. So that is why Alaska Hawaii is different than, for example, like Northwest Delta.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Ready for our next question? Awesome. All right. So we're talking about hubs right now. So as part of the merger, are you aware kind of the, hub and spoke model?
Yeah. Generally speaking. Yeah.
Okay, great. As part of the merger, the client is looking to transform Honolulu into a hub for service around the Pacific. A member of your team has run the numbers on what service would look like with and without the hub. I want you to calculate the revenue and profit impact of using Honolulu as a hub. And I'm going
Okay.
to share this exhibit with you as long as technology cooperates.
Perfect.
Can you see it?
I can. Yes.
Awesome.
Um,
And then the specific question
okay.
is, if the improvements to Honolulu Airport require an investment of 500 million, how long will it take to pay back?
Okay, time to pay back. Perfect. So if we look at this chart that you've put up here, we can see one column is the existing service, so what they're currently doing, and then one is if they were to switch to the Honolulu hub. And then you can see a number of criteria here. So the flight per day, seats per flight, the load factor, which I guess is the percentage of occupancy on the flight. Is that the right way to think about load factor?
That's right. How full is it?
Perfect. Average one-way fare, fuel cost per flight, and operating costs per flight. So just by quickly looking at this, it looks like most of the elements are actually the same. 3 of them are the same, 3 of them are different. So we can see the load factor would be slightly higher with the Honolulu hub. We can see that the fuel cost, there's a rise in fuel prices with the hub, which makes sense, like it's flying a little bit farther each time. And then we can see that the operating costs are higher with existing service. So it looks like what we should do is understand what the differential sort of profit would be from each of these areas, and then see what the payback period would be on the 500 million investment. Does that sound right to you?
I love it.
Perfect. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start with the revenue, and I'm going to look at no hub, so our existing service, what we're currently doing. And I'm going to calculate the revenue, I'll take the average fare times the number of seats, and then I'm going to multiply that by the load factor, and then the number of flights per day to get the total flights. So here I can get $250 per fare for no hub times 150 seats times a 70% load factor. And that's going to equal $26,000 per flight in revenue that we're making for no hub. And we can see that in both scenarios, we actually have 1,500 flights per day. So here we're going to multiply it by 1,500, and that equals roughly 40 million per day. Is that right?
That's right.
Perfect. And then if we look at those exact same numbers, use the exact same formula, except just use the numbers in the other column, we'll do the $250 fare times 150 seats. So that was the same as above. And then we'll multiply that instead of 70% load factor a bit higher to 80% for the load factor. And that will actually get us to $30,000 per flight. So we can see that instead of 26,000 with no hub, we have 30,000 with a hub. So we know that it's going to be higher. And if we multiply it by 1,500 flights a day, that's actually 45 million. So 5 million more approximately in revenue if we're doing the hub. But we know because of the operating costs that there's actually going to be more costs. So let's try and figure out what the additional costs are so we can determine the profit. So with the costs, we have the fuel costs plus the operating costs, which is 8,000 plus 5,000. So that's 13,000 per flight times 1,500 flights a day. So for no hub, there's about, is it okay if I round?
Yeah.
It's about 20 million per day. And then for the hub, it's the same where we're going to add fuel plus operating costs. So 10,000 plus 2,500, which equals $12,500 per flight. Multiply one last time by the 1,500 flights a day, and we get to also approximately 20 million a day. So actually not a significant difference on the cost because the fuel and the operating seem to weight each other out. So what that comes down to is that the profit is actually going to be an incremental $5 million per day by using the hub and spoke model, which is quite incredible when you think about it. And then if we look at that versus our 500 million investment, that's about 100 days that we would take to pay back, which is a very, very short period of time, just over 3 months to pay back that investment. So I think as a next step, what I would want to do is really evaluate that 500 million investment. I think oftentimes with infrastructure investments, the initial estimate is not actually met. So we'd want to see like, what are the risks? What are the contingencies around that? And I would also really want to look at this fare. I'm thinking if someone would have to like deboard a plane, reboard a plane to get to their same destination, they might not be willing to pay as much, but sort of pressure testing some of those assumptions would be my next step.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think my basic reaction, right, is so you're telling me that I can invest $500 million and in 200 days I can double that investment, right? Like that feels like, what's your immediate reaction if I told you I have a great investment idea for you? I need a $500 million and I'll turn it into $1 billion in 200 days.
I think anybody on the planet who had $500 million would give it to you in a second.
Yeah.
If I had
Or
500 million, it would be going to you.
sure, sure. If I could guarantee it, right? But I think my question
Right,
is like,
but you
would you
can't.
trust it?
I mean, that's the thing. I think that's where you really do have to pressure test the numbers. I do think the hub and spoke model, to your point earlier, where you said, like, let's compare this to a similar situation. The hub and spoke model is used in the airline industry all over the place. It's going to be a pretty easy investment to justify. I'm sure there are 100 case studies that you could come up with where you could show the math and how it's worked out. So I do think that it's probably going to be a pretty good investment.
Okay, awesome. All right, so good news. Alaska did decide to go forward and is proceeding with plans to make Honolulu a hub. But bad news. We're getting word that we have one passenger in particular that is very negatively impacted. Passenger lives in San Diego and flies to Maui 3 times a year. Like now that the flights are routing through Honolulu in the updated hub model, this passenger's one-time travel will increase from 5.5 hours to 8.5 hours each day. And let me tell you, he's pissed. Right. Been a long time loyalty program manager, program member. He's very upset, taking to social media to complain about the merger, disparaging the airlines. How
Wow.
dare they add 3 hours to my flight to get to Maui? It's a bunch of dummies over there. He's very mad. What would you do?
Just imagine the tweets, let me tell
So
you.
many, just a
So many.
firestorm. Every time he hops on the plane, he's live tweeting about us on his flights.
Oh
It's
no.
it's a mess.
I think first they should look into discontinuing the free Wi-Fi for the loyalty members in that case.
That's a good
Just kidding, just kidding.
yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like we need a bit of a PR team on this. So if we look at the steps that we would need to take, um, for me, the first thing in this type of situation that I think brands should do is always just acknowledge the impact that they've had. You know, an apology costs absolutely nothing and it can sometimes go a long way. And just say, like, we're really sorry you've been inconvenienced, that we've added 3 hours times 3 trips a year. That's 9 hours of this guy's life. I get it. It's not, he's not happy about it. Acknowledge it. Tell him that you know you're sorry about the impact that it's had on his life. And then that's where I think more of the like monetary compensation might be able to come in. The first, I think, is just in the respective points. It sounds like he's a loyalty member. We obviously want him to stay loyal. And so saying like, here's some free points, responding to the tweets and saying, here's some points for compensation for your inconvenience might help him retain him for his future trips, but also just a couple of free points goes a long way sometimes. And if we still didn't think that was enough, the third sort of step or third option might be even to add a cash bonus in there and just say like, next time you book on the same route, you get $50 off. Again, would do very little to our bottom line, especially when we're looking at that 50 million, 500 million in 100 days sort of target there. It really doesn't impact that, but might go a long way for him and for our brand. But overall, I do just want to clarify that this is one person. There could be thousands of people who are being impacted in a similar way, who maybe just aren't as active on social media, or maybe one of their trips of the year just has not come up yet. So I think that what's important is creating some type of like system in which we would be able to intake the complaints and some system that we would use to deal with it in a very standardized way. We don't want to have hundreds of people having to work on this and sort of squash the customer service complaints and be responding on Twitter. We want to be able to have a very like systemized way to respond. So I think creating a system and replicating that over and over for all the impacted customers.
How would you think about creating a system to deal with angry people versus proactively trying to prevent them? Like which method are you going down?
I think that if you're a B2C brand, you will always have customers who are upset about something. You
Mhm.
can do something that's going to work for 80% of people, but not for the 20%, and the 20% will always complain. So I think, yes, there might be a certain, like, you have a message on the website, we're sorry for all customers impacted by our new routing. fine. But I do think you're always going to need a team to sort of help with the individual complaints from customers and sort of the more reactive team.
Awesome. Okay, great. So got a note from the CFO,
No.
pretty worried. He is worried that the companies are not adequately preparing for the risks of the integration. In a timeline wise, this has to be post. We've already merged, but we're worried, or we've already completed the transaction, as you're aware, right? But
Yeah.
he's worried that the teams are not prepared for the risks. What do you
Okay.
see the major risk for this project, and how would you mitigate them?
Great question. So the first risk I would say is just from an operational perspective. So I think one is just from like inefficiencies. People are going to be learning new systems. They're going to be learning new routes. They're going to need to learn the thing they're supposed to say when there's an angry customer. Lots of new stuff that's going to happen, and people are going to be inefficient. And then secondly is from a safety perspective, like we are in the business of flying people in the air from one place to another. It's not the world's safest activity. So just making sure, I mean, it's not that unsafe, but you know what I mean? There have to be protocols
It's
that are
more
followed.
dangerous than sitting on your couch eating Cheerios and watching cartoons.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Less dangerous than base jumping.
There you go.
Somewhere
Perfect.
between those two is
Somewhere in
what we're
between. We
basically
don't
saying. Okay.
exactly know.
Got it.
So my mitigation for that would be just a phased implementation of this. Like before the merger, the two companies were operating perfectly fine. If it takes a little bit longer to sort of implement, but it can be done in a way that's methodological and that people are safe and that people understand what's going on, that's the best way, even if it takes like a full year or two to get to the very end. What I would say about the phased integration is just the team sort of prioritizing the elements that will have the biggest impact first and then phasing down from there.
Great. Um, Excellent recommendation, but bad news. Our
I know.
CFO friend is still in an absolute huff.
Okay. So we need another risk.
We're presenting to them tomorrow, right? And they are concerned that the merger is not even worthwhile.
Oh boy.
Not even, why did we even do this thing? Right? I'm going to unmerge, demerge.
Wow.
Yeah. So, what's your final recommendation on like how to get the most value and kind of reassure the CFO to not take their ball and go home?
Okay, well, I think the first thing is really just reorienting the CFO and ourselves and everyone in terms of what the goal of this merger was. The goal of the merger was not to reduce customer complaints. The goal of the merger was to maximize revenue and profitability of the combined airline. Okay, and I think that sort of the way in to do that is to maintain the distinct brands. And maybe if there are some things that need to be maintained as a result of that, some separate operations, that's okay. They're going to each have their own website, for example, but it's really just maintaining those distinct brands, maintaining the distinct way that they currently are. And then second is to transform Honolulu into a hub. That's really what needs to be done in order to maximize the profitability of the airlines. We saw there was increased revenue by doing that, and I think that that's probably the most important thing to sort of reassure the CFO. And then the third thing I would do to reassure him is just say, like, we're with you on this next phase of the journey. And there are some next steps that we can continue to look into to make sure that you're supported as this goes on. No one wants to feel like they're alone. So sort of reassuring the CFO and saying, like, let's really look back into those infrastructure investments and let's finalize what we think those were. And let's also initiate the brand loyalty program across the two programs to really, continue to push that branding, that customer retention, and make sure that they're all supported in this next phase of the combined company journey.
I think you did it. I think they're calming down. They're going to proceed. I think we should feel all right. Very good. Awesome. Well, Tessa, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. And we'll be back with you with a final decision.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, it's Kenton Kavesti here, the founder of Rocketblocks. Thank you so much for watching this mock interview video. I hope you found it informative and helpful as you are getting ready to prepare for your own interviews and hopefully landing that job offer you are excited about. We have a ton of great content on the Rocket Blocks channel coming out on a weekly basis, mock interviews, mini lessons, and chats with our Rocket Blocks experts. So if you haven't subscribed yet already, please do so. There is a big red button below. And if you hit that, you'll get all of our content as soon as it comes out. Thanks for watching and have a great day.